Abraham Lincoln must be turning in his grave to hear the senators from the grand old party, the party of abolition and emancipation and Reconstruction, echoing the states' rights rhetoric of Dixiecrat segregationists to oppose federal voting rights legislation, to oppose even the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 2021, just one Republican senator had the courage and principle to vote to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the senator from Alaska, Senator Murkowski. Just one. For decades, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was bipartisan. Today, only one Republican senator will stand up for this landmark achievement of the civil rights movement. Not Senator Cohen of Texas, who previously said the Voting Rights Act is simply the most important and most effective civil rights legislation ever passed, bar none. No longer his position. Not my friend, the senator from Maine, Senator Collins, who previously said this bill will ensure that the voting rights afforded to all Americans are protected. Not Senator Burr of North Carolina, who previously said voting rights for all American citizens, regardless of race, are granted by the 15th Amendment and enforced by the Voting Rights Act. And not the minority leader, who previously said this is a good piece of legislation which has served an important purpose over many years, and this landmark piece of legislation will continue to make a difference not only in the South, but for all Americans and for all of us, whether we are African Americans or not. Not the minority leader, the same minority leader who said this bill eliminated the barriers to voting so that all Americans could participate in the basic opportunity each of us have. Who celebrated, quote, "We have renewed the Voting Rights Act periodically since that time, overwhelmingly and on a bipartisan basis year after year, because members of Congress realize that this is a piece of legislation that has worked." No more. Not in 2022. Only one Republican senator stood up to support the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When Congressman John Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boynton and hundreds of others marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, when John Lewis had his skull fractured on that bridge for daring to demand the right to vote for Black Americans in the American South, it was the example of their courage and their sacrifice that paved the way for passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As my colleague, my brother, Senator Reverend Warnock, has often observed, when Congressman Lewis passed, there were many in this chamber on both sides who rightly celebrated his towering achievements and his legacy. But I speak for the state of Georgia when I say, do not invoke Congressman Lewis' name to signal your virtue while you work to erode his legacy and defy his will.
This is Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff from Georgia speaking in defense of eliminating the filibuster to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. It's an issue that Ossoff holds especially dear, not just because voting rights are the cornerstone of our democracy, but he interned for the late John Lewis too, meaning his connection to this issue is deeply personal, and he made that obvious. The vote to create a carve-out on the filibuster ultimately failed when Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema joined all 50 Republicans in voting against the rule change. Now, first off, Manchin and Sinema couched their opposition in not wanting to create any further division in what's already a polarized environment. But here's the thing, it's not the filibuster that's causing division, it's the Republicans stripping away voting rights. Eliminating the filibuster isn't the problem here, it is quite literally the solution. And the fact that Manchin and Sinema can't recognize that simple reality is all the proof you need that they can't see the forest through the trees. But I do want to make clear that it's not just Manchin and Sinema who are at fault, because every last Republican also voted against it. And I know that we focused our attention on Manchin and Sinema because they're Democrats and they should do better, but let's also not absolve Republicans simply because they've set the bar on the floor. Just because we don't expect them to adhere to the most basic principles of democracy doesn't mean they get a pass every single time. This is a party that is doing everything in its power to subvert our free and fair elections. And look, they may claim that this is all in response to some non-existent voter fraud or the big lie or whatever other BS they cook up, but in reality, it's in response to voter turnout. Republicans do not believe that Democrats have the right to be elected to office. They'll spout off about whatever tepid excuses they can think of, but in reality, they won't support voting rights because they don't support voting. The fact is that Republicans had the opportunity to realize that their agenda isn't popular, that people aren't looking to vote for a party that gives tax cuts to billionaires and pretends climate change isn't real and strips women of their bodily autonomy, and to change those things. But they opted not to change their platform, they just decided to change the rules. And so they've spent the last year introducing hundreds of voter suppression bills in 49 states. They've closed down polling places in minority-majority precincts. They've allowed Republican-led state legislatures to reorganize local elections boards. They've eliminated drop boxes in Democratic strongholds. They've made it harder to register. Anything they could do to make the process insurmountable, they did. And not for nothing, but if you're confident in your platform, if you're confident in your message, if you're confident in your campaign, you don't need to do any of this. And yet the fact that they are doing it really does speak volumes. And look, I don't know what will happen with voting rights legislation or whether there's any way to pass any of it, but I will say this, Americans see what's happening and they have a long history of pushing back against efforts to eliminate voting rights. In 2020 in Wisconsin, while COVID was newly surging across the US, there was a state Supreme Court race wherein Democrats tried to get mail ballots sent to every voter to avoid unnecessary contact during the pandemic, especially considering we had no vaccines at that time. Republicans rebuffed those efforts, and in places like Milwaukee, which normally have 180 polling places, voters were left waiting on lines as long as 4 hours in just 5 polling places. It was a purposeful tactic to sink Democratic chances of winning. And yet in that state, which has seen margins in the last 2 presidential elections of only 20,000 votes, the Democratic candidate Joe Karofsky won by over 160,000 votes. The point is that Republicans did everything they could to manipulate the democratic process. They shoved 500,000 eligible voters into just 5 precincts during a public health emergency, thinking full well that they had it in the bag. What they didn't count on was the backlash. So look, I'm not going to say that we're going to out-organize voter suppression or that we even can, but I will say that we've been in positions like this before where Republicans tried to undermine the right to vote and we did come out on top. So if you're mad right now, remember this feeling and take it with you to the ballot box in November, along with a few friends. Because if Republicans think they can strip you of your rights and suffer no consequences, then they must not be paying attention. To see more videos like this, click the subscribe button right here on this screen. And if you want to support my work, subscribe to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I cover the most important stories each week, and my guest is always one of the top political figures, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Nancy Pelosi, Katie Porter, Cory Booker, and so many more. The podcast link is also right here on this screen, so give it a listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.